I'd like to share some thoughts on the notion of deep water, and I'd like to begin this by looking at the progression of the economy for the last few hundred years. If we look at this progression, we see that we began with something called the agricultural economy. It morphed into the industrial economy, and it's morphing today into the digital economy. If we consider the nature of these economies, we see that the agricultural economy is about what the eye can see. So we work with physical implements on a physical environment and create physical product. So the nature is something that's very physical. When we think about the industrial economy, we're thinking about much more assertive and aggressive flows of a much larger category. So there's flows of finance, flows of product, flows between markets, flows of supplies. And so the nature of this is much more vital. And when we think about the digital economy, it's much more about ideas that rearrange business reality and organizational reality. So it's much more mental in nature. Now, taking another cut at this, if we look at just the digital economy, if we expand this out and consider how it has progressed, we'll see that we began with something that perhaps we call websites that began to give way to something we call e-commerce, and that's beginning to give way to something that perhaps we call value orientation. And if we consider the nature of these three phases, websites is all about taking physical materials or existing physical patterns and mapping them onto another medium. So it's physical in nature. If we think about e-commerce, it's about taking some key business flows. So for instance, the customer ordering process or the customer fulfillment process, and reorienting our business models around that. So it's much more vital in nature. And if we think about value orientation, it's about taking a business and deconstructing and reconstructing it around a key value proposition that then becomes the center around which we create a value web. So that's much more mental in nature. Now if we think about the kind of attitude or the orientation that's required to make these shifts from one phase to the other, then we'll look at, say, an organization that views the world as fixed. Its markets are fixed, its customers are fixed, its product is fixed. That will only allow a certain kind of an innovation to take place, or a certain kind of decision set to come to the surface, and that's physical in nature. If there's an orientation around financial metrics, so that there's now, for example, focus on market share or revenue or cash flow, then suddenly everything that had defined the business previously by its fixed world is no longer fixed, because now an organization can make a lot of changes in the way that it conducts business so long as it meets those financial metrics. So it's much more vital in nature. And if an organization becomes purpose-driven, then even the finance doesn't matter, because whatever it wants to achieve, it achieves regardless of the finance and regardless of the metrics or the reality of its business till yesterday. And so that's much more mental in nature. Now the interesting thing is that, so we see three different levels displaying the same pattern. So there's a fractal reality here, and if we were to extract out a notion of order across these different levels, what we would see is that there's some kind of a natural progression from the physical to the vital, to the mental. And the interesting point here is that it's not that at some point you had organizations come together and decide that now it's time to move from the agricultural to the industrial, or from the industrial to the digital. This happened by itself almost as a necessity, because there was a kind of, I would say, a blueprint embedded in a circumstance itself that forces circumstance to move in a certain direction. So we can represent this natural progression between these three stages as the growth of a flower, and this is again just a metaphor, but the seed represents a fixed orientation, the stalk a much more aggressive growth in many directions, and the flower, the intent inherent in the seed, coming to the surface. So we represent this notion of this natural progression that's occurring across different scale and economy by this growth of a seed into a flower. Now the interesting thing is that gives us one level of order, but if we consider this question or this reality more deeply, in the sense that we have this growth occurring, or this progression. Here I've just taken something from the realm of economy, but this kind of pattern is pervasive across organizations and across systems if we look closely enough. And what that tells us is that no matter where we're looking at, which region of the world, which industry, what organization, we'll find that this kind of progression occurs. So there's a kind of an omnipresence, if you will, to this pattern. It occurs no matter where you're looking at. The other interesting thing is that there's another property which I'd call omnipotence, in that no matter what the reality is, whether it's at the macro economy level, or at an organization level, or at a decision-making level, or amongst 100 other examples, there's always the movement forward. So regardless of the obstacles, and we know there are so many obstacles to progress, the progress still happens. So there's a kind of an omnipotence that comes to the surface, or there's something deep inside that's omnipotent that causes this progression to happen. There's also something that I call omniscience or omniscience, because here there's an all-knowingness that no matter what field we're in, no matter what industry, what part of the world, what organization, the right instruments are chosen, the right people, the right decisions are made. So there's kind of a deep omniscience that perhaps oversees this kind of a progression. And then the very fact that we're moving from a reality of the physical to something different, which is at the end of the day more fulfilling for a larger number of players, means that there is some kind of a deep omnicaring. So if we look at a second level of order, so the first level was this notion of the seed becoming a flower, or this progression through the physical, vital, mental, that's one level of order. But if we look at a second, deeper level of order, we find that there are four guiding principles, if you will, or four principles that within which all our activity at the organizational system level occurs. And if we think about this yet further, because these are large, perhaps philosophical concepts in some way, but practically speaking, this notion of omnipresence, when we think about it more tangibly, it's this notion of service, because this thing is there to serve everything that exists so that it may progress in a certain way. The omnipotence is something about, if I were to make that more tangible, it's about power adventure, because no matter what, the decisions are made and there's a certain kind of circuit that goes through, and so there's this notion of power or adventure. Omniscience more practically relates to knowledge, and omnicaring to this notion of harmony. So we think about four tangible guiding principles. That would be the notion of a service of adventure, of knowledge, and of harmony. Now, if we think about a certain time-space continuum, so let's think about time, and here when we think about this level of order, it's really an order through time, because we are seeing a progression through certain phases. And so there's the physical, the vital, mental. And when we think about space, the other axis of our existence, if you will, then what we find is that in any space we have these four principles that exist at any single point in space. And if we take a space-time continuum, so this is some space-time continuum at some time and space, then what we can say about this is that always there will be more of the flower in this reality, and that flower will reflect more of these four principles than a space-time continuum at a different or lower in this web, or in this wedge here. If we think about this wedge itself, I would call this wedge a wedge of causality, and really what it's implying is that there's a comprehensive causal model that exists in space and time by which this progression from the seed to the flower can occur regardless of the kind of organization and system, and within the framework of these four larger principles, which we can think of as omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnicaring. The point of this is that when we think about our causal models in the organizational and system space, what this points to is that there is a real opportunity to reconstruct our organization and system causal models based on this wedge of causality within a space-time continuum, to come up with a wholly different way by which we perceive the development of organizations and systems, and a totally different way by which we can begin to make decisions that are more holistic and sustainable.